Hello and welcome back to the Hegel Book Club. It's your boy Byron the Goat Man, and take a look at who's with us. It's none other than Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel himself, who got his landlady pregnant and ran away in 1807. So that's quite a story.
Wow.
Yeah, that tells you about what kind of man he was.
Good for him, I guess.
Yeah, it's pulling the Elon Musk type of route. But I don't want to go on too many tangents so early. So the point is that we want to resume our progress through this book and help to guide you, the audience, through this intellectual, spiritual journey of the phenomenology of spirit. So I just want to give you a short update about how far we've gotten so far. I'm personally still in the preface. I am pretty close to finishing the preface, but I know that Nate has already finished the preface. And so, Nate, I want to ask you, how far have you gotten with the text?
I finished the introduction, and I've decided I don't want to read any further.
Wow.
But I'll let you know why.
Okay. Now, we need to, before we get into that, I think we should give the audience some background about, what's going on with this text. And so I think we already covered that with the preface, it's a general outline where Hegel uses negativity and he criticizes other types of philosophy or thinking to establish that his type of philosophy is necessary. And he also establishes a general idea of what the dialectic method is supposed to mean and how it's supposed to work, and things of that nature. While in the introduction, it seems to be, based on my memory, it was kind of about the nature of thought and thought as mediated. And so, at this time I can't say too much about it, but I might as well ask you, Nate, what your thoughts are.
That is a very good question. I guess, so I had mentioned in the first video that I had some concerns about the writing and some difficulties, and I think I've gotten some clarity on some of the issues I have.
Okay.
And let me put it this way. So it's going to be a difficult thing to describe logically, but
Okay.
I really feel like Hegel is a Saruman kind of figure. He is like this, in a way, powerful wizard, but he is ultimately serving, he's using thought to serve evil, I believe.
Interesting.
And I can give several quotes to kind of support this.
Okay.
But also, I guess to motivate the idea a little bit more. If we look at the the Genesis story, how did man get kicked out of the Garden of Eden? Well, they were tempted by the serpent to eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And this book here is all about the search for that knowledge, that knowledge of the universe, but to wield it for power. I feel like ultimately for our own power. I think it really comes. There are certain assumptions that Hegel's operating with. They kind of give this indication. One is kind of just what is this absolute? So in the introduction, for example, he is. I'll just read some quotes. So.
Okay.
He says, at the beginning of the introduction, it is necessary to come first to an understanding concerning knowledge, which is looked upon as the instrument by which to take possession of the absolute, or as the means through which to get a sight of it. later on he talks, there's a quote that says like, knowledge he says, we want to know the absolute as science wants to do. And later on he says like, the words absolute and knowledge and so on, they're words which presuppose a meaning that is first to be got at. And he says this, but he's the one that's putting forth these words. He actually seems to me to assume that they have a meaning. He's like, we are on this journey towards the absolute. What is it? He doesn't make that totally clear. I mean, we know it involves knowledge, and he sort of he attributes this almost like, he attributes to science a will of its own, really. It's not, it's not a matter of what should we do, or, what am I interested in doing. He's like, science has a will of its own, and there is an inevitable course to history and to the future, basically. And so these are some of the signs. But I guess I can go into more detail. But I'm curious, like, if you have any thoughts about this so far.
I mean, there's a lot to say. There's a lot I could say. Might as well mention first that if you go to a philosopher such as Zizek, and I believe other people mentioned that Hegel was used for totalitarian ideologies, because Hegel was a totalizing philosopher. And so Hegel, even if you read this book, there are, like I said, there are basically like no people in this book. Instead, there are these abstract entities: consciousness, spirit, the collective, history, and things like that. And with that being the case, it is like almost the opposite of individualism. And I can't claim that's a fully developed claim, but it at least generally fits the way he operates and what he focuses on. And it's sort of the absolute. I think also we want to take into consideration some historical context with regards to like the absolute. So I think in the past there were certain like obsessions that philosophers had in different eras. So and especially in different places. So I think in Germany around this time there was a big obsession with a concept called the thing itself, or the thing in itself. And there was this quest to know the true nature of things. And some people said there were different ways to achieve this. You had Kant, who was more like a skeptic, saying that we cannot know the inner nature of things. And then other people saying that we could know the inner nature of things. So I believe perhaps Fichte, I might be wrong, but Fichte supposedly, believed that, supposedly objective reality is projected out of the self or projected out of the ego, and so that the ego is like the true reality. Or Schopenhauer argued that the will is the true reality, and that we could learn the inner essence of the objective world through the inner world of the self. And conversely, Hegel takes a different approach, and Hegel's like, no, we can know the absolute, we can know the thing in itself, because the thing in itself is the whole. So instead of trying to focus on individual objects, Hegel's approach is to focus on the collective or the totality in the quest of the true or pure knowledge. And so I think it's important to mention this historical background before we get too far, or before we get much farther into like some of these other ideas that you mentioned.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I do think this is a bit of a tangent. In a way, I mean, I think you can look at actually like the different philosophies happening in an era, and they definitely represent like different. I don't know, I don't want to be too abstract, but let's say like different kinds of energies, different kinds of motivations that people have. And like for example, like Kierkegaard I mentioned last week, you know, he was a contemporary of Hegel's and had criticisms, and he was kind of saying the same thing about like individuality.
Mm-hmm.
But they're talking about they're talking about similar topics, but they have different very different perspectives. Like I almost see Kierkegaard as kind of the like, he's like on the side of the you know, Middle Earth, and Hegel's on the side of Mordor, or you know,
Wow.
but they're kind of talking about this, you know, and you know, I don't want to like, you know, I did say, you know, Hegel is kind of a Saruman figure, in my opinion. Like I don't want to, he's not some chump, but I think ultimately there's some fallacies, just like logical fallacies in his work too. For example, so it all comes back to, yeah, the ego and like what it means to exist and where our motivation comes from. Like so there's a lot of works. I mean, it includes like, there's a lot of philosophical works that are really obscure,
Yes.
dense, and I actually think this is a hypothesis, but this is my hypothesis, which is, you know, that's, you know, some things are, you know, like, okay, I don't want to mix it up. So I mean, like there's certain texts. Let's consider like the Tao Te Ching, you know, the teachings of Jesus. These things like this, which are poetical and dense, and it's because they're, you know, they're pointing to some experiential truth that can't be directly said in words. So I want to distinguish between that, which I wouldn't call that like obscure. I would call that poetry, basically.
Okay.
And there's another kind of thing which is like very much more wordy. It's actually like lots of words and very dense and obscure. And I tend to think that the reason it's so obscure is because it's actually like the ego hiding its true motivations from itself. And let me just give one example of this. So, because, okay, when you read Hegel, and the reason I wanted to point this out too is because like, you can get caught up in these details and totally forget. I mean, I'm glad you bring in the historical context, because you need some kind of context, because you can read this line and be like, well, I guess that kind of makes sense, and get caught up in the details. But there are like certain assumptions that you got to really focus on. So like one big thing he talks about is like consciousness. I don't have the exact quote, but it's like consciousness is like a notion to itself. Is its own notion. I think this is a trick. This is basically the foundation, like the foundational trick that the ego plays. So basically, what is the ego? Or what do I think the ego is? It's, you know, it's this. It's definitely thought-oriented process. Probably mostly centered out of our left brain, and you know, but it's, you know, it's a conceptual kind of thinking. So it's always like, it's thinking in terms of thoughts. Like this could be expressed in terms of language. Like, you know, I need to get this job. It's like some concept of who I am, of what this job is. It could also be through like more visual thinking. Like for example, you may imagine like what will happen in the future if I take these actions. But that's still a mental thing, you know, like all these things you're imagining are your concepts of maybe people and different things. And these concepts are built through experience. We basically identify like patterns and encapsulate them, but they're a mental thing. So there's concepts, and then there's the process of reasoning with these concepts in different ways. That's what the ego does. One of these concepts is the concept of self, of I. But, and I think, that's what Hegel's talking about when he says that, like, consciousness is a notion, a concept to itself. But this concept is different from the reasoning process. Now the trick, like, I think there's a reason why it can be confused, because, like, if you're in a habit, if you develop the habit of overthinking, which can be encouraged by education, things like this, your concept of self comes from your experience of, like, what you do. And if what you're doing all the time is thinking, that's all you're doing, then you kind of, like, that kind of is your concept. So it can create this confusion. But the actual, like, act of thinking is always different from the concept. The concept is what the thinking uses. But these two things are different. And I think Hegel is getting them confused, basically. Because no amount of a concept will never ever become reality. It's always a concept. It's always different. And I mean, Hegel, to some extent, like, does seem to kind of know this. Because he talks about, for example, the knowledge being cut off from the absolute, like, fundamentally. But he has, like, a belief, I feel like, that there is a way for them to become unified. But I just don't think that's based in science of actually what's going on in thought,
So, it does seem like Hegel believes that it's possible for, like, one person to, like, basically understand everything, or for a collective of people to collectively understand everything, or I suppose maybe at least understand the things that are very deep and long-term and metaphysical and things of that nature, and such as the progress of consciousness, assuming that there is progress in consciousness. And it's one of the premises of the phenomenology is for consciousness to have a dialectic or a progressive. We haven't got into it yet, but as I said before, like, he starts with sensation, which I think is a fine place to start, and he moves on to object recognition, and then the recognition of causality, and then self-consciousness, and then different stages of self-consciousness, and then on to rationality, and then on to what he calls spirit. And then, while spirit is supposed to be the precedent of religion, and then religion is supposed to precede absolute knowledge. And so, I mean, I think he makes clear, or other people at least make clear, that this is not supposed to be, like, the only way to get to the absolute, but I don't know of anybody else who's done anything equivalent to this. And so Hegel has kind of set up, like, one path, and a lot of it is contingent, and, like, it's kind of historical. It's a mix of, like, historical contingency with other types of contingency, and he actually, in the preface, he actually dedicates space to self-movement. So he actually dedicates, like, multiple paragraphs, I think, to, like, criticizing mathematics, or you're, like, saying that mathematics is limited because it's the dialectic of a mathematical proof, for lack of better words, is it's external to the thing itself. And Hegel's implying that what he's going to do is internal to the thing itself, and that from the inner nature of the thing itself, it will have these contradictions rise up, and we can continually, step out into new frames or broader frames that encompass what came before, and somehow this is, like, progressive. And, like, that seems pretty, like, a decent idea on its own, but, I do think we have to treat Hegel with some suspicion for his writing style. And, I think if, now that you've said these things, it makes me think, like, well, what was his inner heart? Like, what was he...
Yeah, that's actually what I wanted to ask.
Yeah.
It's like, because why, like, I guess we should take a step back and ask, why are we seeking this absolute knowledge? I mean, he paints this as like this should be the goal of existence, but I could see, an easy argument against this, because it almost seems like he's saying, just experience is a means to knowledge, this kind of knowledge. Why do we want this? I get the impression, that the only answer he gives to that really is, this is what must happen, science, this is what science wants. It's got a will of its own. Forgot what else I was gonna say. But I mean, I can totally, like, another person would be like, well, knowledge is just, that's not the end, that's the means. The goal is maybe the good life or something, like the Greeks would say.
Right.
Knowledge can help us get there, but he sort of like has this idea that, like, I don't know what it is, but I tend to think it's like this kind of power is really what he's seeking.
And I think that this is kind of a reaction to what we might call the death of God or the decline of religion. And I think in an earlier era, he might have just been content to relegate more space on his pages to God and give more credit to God with his writing. And I think that, if you look at his earlier life, when he was much younger, he wrote supposedly a strange document called The Life of Jesus, where he wrote his own version of Jesus that basically imitated or expounded the philosophy of Immanuel Kant, and having Jesus like express the universalistic, rigid, like ethical system of Kant. And most people, I don't think most people have even read that. I've never read it myself, but it's kind of like a short clue of what I'm talking about, which is that Hegel is reacting to a vacuum, so like the decline of religion. So he published this book in 1807. So by that point, the church had already declined already. It's 300 years since the Reformation, 1,500 years or 1,800 years since like the start of Christianity. So there was, the Enlightenment had already started. We already had the Renaissance. And there was all this undermining of religion, and I think Hegel has like some religious inclination, and he's still, some people still consider him a good theologian, at least in certain ways, and I can attest to that at least a little bit, but I think that a lot of what's going on, like this totalizing behavior, this speaking of the absolute, is trying to basically substitute or replace God or take the place of God, etc. Yeah.
I think you're totally right. Yeah, I mean, we could say it's definitely, well, the decline of religion too, that goes hand in hand with basically industrial revolution, right, to some extent. I hate to use the word capitalism because it's too divisive of a word, but
we already had the French Revolution by this time, things like that. There's already the 30 Years' War in Germany and Europe. People are already getting used to like Muslim-Christian alliances for practical reasons, and so people were already like distancing themselves, from Christianity, and so to some extent Hegel is contributing to the decline of Christianity, but he's also the product of the decline of Christianity. And so I think I suppose it's pretty plausible that he would not want to admit to himself or others, what's in his heart. But if you look at his life, you can see what's in his heart. He got his landlady pregnant and ran away, and then at some point he ended up in Berlin and became like the super philosopher of Germany, and he became like the philosophical chairman of like this great university in Berlin, and he became like the super philosopher, and people would listen to him, people would come to his classes to listen to him speak, and students would collect notes from his lectures, and even after he died they'd compile the notes into like a great encyclopedia to like explain like what he was talking about. And supposedly he was much more clear as a speaker than as a writer. Supposedly when he was writing, he much more obfuscated what he was talking about, and so, which is interesting. But the inner heart, I think, you know, you could see this desire for power even as he publishes later works, like The Philosophy of Right, where he's essentially like justifying the Prussian monarchy. And, you know, maybe the Prussian monarchy might have probably had its, you know, merits, but it's a symptom that like he would prefer to write philosophy that supports his government than criticizes government, because by virtue of the government having its power, he gets to have his power as basically the chief priest of German philosophy until he died of disease.
Yep, it's a lot like Lord of the Rings again. Sorry,
Right.
I was just watching that recently, but
Hegel
no, but I think
books.
this is an important point though, because I mean this is a pressing issue today too, which is like I've heard some quote before, like some young person was like a Satan worshiper, and somebody asked like, why are you a Satan worshiper? And they said like, well, I want to be on the winning side. And I think that's actually like what happens now, you know, like people, I mean, you know, first of all, like the seeking of power, it's a very natural thing, you know. I think this is an age-old thing, and it would be silly to just call it like stupid or to think it can be vanquished and go away forever, you know. But here, you know, and people do it because they think it's the best strategy for their life. But I think one important trade-off is, I mean, there's a reason why Hegel gets called like collectivist. There's a reason why Marx was a huge fan of Hegel. It goes back. I'm going to use the Lord of the Rings analogy one more time. What did Gandalf told Saruman, like, you know, there's only one ruler of the ring, and he does not share power. When you take this strategy, you're not becoming an individual. You're, you know, essentially your ego is serving this just hunger for power, and it actually has to hide the motives from itself. That's why it's so collectivist. It's just dominating, you know. So I think that's important to point out.
And for those of you who've been following my channel, you know that I've been recently speaking out against collective ownership, and in my own experience, I found that collective ownership, you know, doesn't work because we don't have the right incentives. When people own their own property and their own spaces and their own content, their own platforms, you know, they are much more invested in taking care of them. And, you know, I speaking in my life, I have a desire to be pretty transparent, or an inclination to be pretty transparent, and, you know, even to my bad self. You know, I was recently speaking to a friend, and there was this morally questionable situation where I was going to do something that was kind of, I guess, potentially bad, and my friend was trying to justify it. It was like, oh, if you do this, there's this benefit to it. Oh, it's kind of good for this. I said, no, my friend. I'd just rather just accept the fact that this is what I want to do. I'd rather just accept the idea that I want to do the bad thing rather than trying to make up a justification for it. And I think that, that's a very difficult thing to do. It's very difficult to think that you want to do something bad, and like it'd be hard for Hegel. We have to make some assumptions because he's dead and like we can't speak to him and all this stuff, but we're kind of assuming, we're kind of interpreting that he had this inner heart of power, heart of seeking power that was like obfuscated with a verbose philosophy. And I don't know what else to say at this point, but I think I could appreciate it if we had an alternate version, an alternate history where Hegel could have been more clear and just accepted, if this was his heart of darkness, I'd rather him just be transparent about it and write a more concise book.
True, and I think, okay, yeah, I mean, and it's also like I'm hesitant to be too fruity, because, but,
Okay.
it's like the old, too fruity. It's like the saying, like, hate the sin, not the sinner. It's not Hegel. And I would actually, we definitely, like, it'd be silly to attribute this all to him. But actually, like, a lot of what he says, I think, is very interesting, because I think he does understand a lot. I mean, he understands a lot about the process of how the mind works, I can tell. And this is this is before most of our science. I mean, this and he also has a good, like, feel for there's a lot of things about, like, what's happening in his era that's kind of hinted in this. And actually, so, like, I was reading the introduction.
Okay.
And I started getting these inklings that I'm sharing now. Like, things started making more sense, and I'm like, okay, I don't like this. But then afterwards, I'm like, I had a different feeling, because it's like, it's not like, the fact that I don't like this, it's not like I would tell people to burn Hegel. No, I mean, we can, like, if we understand these things and we have the context and stuff, we can kind of understand Hegel. It's actually informative. It's informative. You can read it, you can question it, you can see it also as, like, a powerful data point for, like, the human psyche and the era of history and all these things. It's definitely giving me some insight into, like, the nature of power, the nature of evil, those kinds of things, how it operates, because
those are some very striking things to say. And I need to add something on top of this. So someone observed, this is not my original idea, but someone observed that each philosopher tends to have, like, a grand vision of what they're hoping to achieve. Maybe you call it their Tower of Babel, and then each time they tend to fail to actually, like, make it stick. Like, some people can really, like, buy into it, and maybe they like it, but the grand project that they set out on, like, tends to not work out, and, like, but in the process, usually, like, a good philosopher, they'll tend to fail at their grand mission, but they tend to bring in a lot of, like, good tidbits along the way, like a lot of good components and observations. And I would apply this to any philosopher that I can think of, to where, like, the super system they tried to build didn't stick, but a lot of the things they observed along the way did. So, like, people like to emphasize Hegel's slave and master dialectic, and that was, like, I think that was one of the major things that Marxists use for their own materialist dialectic. And I would criticize, or I would point out that the Marxist dialectic, by being materialistic, misses out on a lot of what Hegel's dialectic has. And back to my actual point, I think that we can read Hegel without accepting the grand vision. I think we can read Hegel without, like, having to buy into this absolute spirit concept. So we can accept that like there is no end of history. We're not really going to achieve this status because there's no one who's smart enough. No one has a big enough brain. No one can handle the knowledge of the absolute.
Mm-hmm.
It's too much, and each individual is a limited person who gets to just know some of it, whether in the abstract or in the details. And I would say that if you're struggling to continue reading, I would try advocating that more like particular mindset of extracting things along the way, even though we're not buying into like his end goal.
Mm-hmm. Definitely. And yeah, I'd also add that to some extent, kind of what he was saying and what he predicted has come to pass, but it's not like any. It's not that one person has done it, but
Mm-hmm.
I think like the science he's talking about and the will of science. I think the nuclear bomb, the creation of the nuclear bomb, is a great example of how this manifests. It's basically this desire to understand the cosmos in order to wield its power. And we've done that to an impressive degree. It's like the power is real. But yeah, it's like,
Yeah.
why are you doing this? Or
Yeah, I think we can tie this back to Nietzsche and that everything that exists has its own will to power. I think this applies to individual people, and the way it manifests will be different. And so, as you mentioned the nuclear bomb, I thought about the comparison between a nuclear scientist and a jock or a bodybuilder or something like that. And so the bodybuilder or the jock or the athlete has something that the nuclear scientist doesn't have, but then the nuclear scientist has something that they don't have. And so whether it's making a nuclear bomb or running a football, against the Bengals, it's an expression of the will to power. And I think that Hegel is also expressing his will to power by writing this long verbose text. And he has like this, he's using his super brain, he's trying to use his brain to obtain power.
Yep.
Because that's what he has.
Yep.
Each creature has to work with what it has to maximize its power according to the will to power.
Yep.
Yeah.
Totally. Yeah. And even you can definitely have a following up on that. You can definitely have a cynical view of goodness too, which is, you can take this in a positive or a negative way. We are all selfish in some sense. It's kind of like where does creativity or where does the good come from? Well, I'd say one place it comes from is you try and do what the world encourages you to do, and then you find that you don't get fulfillment, and eventually you have to kind of just become an individual, and then you can give birth to something good. But the whole time, you were kind of seeking your will to power, and even then you are. But you also learn maybe why those things you sought before were never going to fulfill you. So it's.
And additionally, I think that I would say if you expand the concept of the self broadly enough, there's no such thing as real altruism. And conversely, if for altruism to be real, we have to diminish the scale of the self or the conception of the self. So if the self is something that's truly individual, specific to an individual person and to a specific time, like a moment or a short period of time, then I think we can consider altruism a true possibility. Because I think oftentimes doing the right thing for other people ends up being what is best for you in the long term, because you can expect people to reciprocate what you do to them and do for them. And conversely, if you do what's best for your progeny, your future generations, or your nation or your country, that's still kind of good for you, just indirectly. And so
yeah,
I thought that was at least tangentially
yeah,
related.
definitely. And I mean, luckily we don't have to luckily we're kind of hardwired to be altruistic. We don't have to think about it. We don't have to yeah, I mean, I definitely am totally against any kind of utilitarian type of
Yeah,
philosophies.
effective altruism.
Oh yeah, totally. Yeah, that's it's like trying to use the ego and quantify everything, but it's not. It's just removing the life from everything.
Right.
Yeah, we're kind of hardwired to do this. We don't have to think about it. When we're thinking too hard about things, it's because probably we've been encouraged to think too hard, too we've been manipulated to do that for someone else's power, desire for power, basically, I think.
Yeah. Now, I wanted to change the topic a little bit.
Yeah.
So, I know that we dedicated really this episode to deconstructing Hegel and psychoanalyzing Hegel, but since you read the introduction, I wanted to ask if there were any more of the particulars that you could speak on, because based on my memory, the introduction was dedicated to this idea of the mediation of thought, and I wanted to see if you got the same impression, at least.
Yeah, see, that's one thing where I think there were some good ideas in there, but twisted. But I think he kind of talks about. Well, I'll just give my impression. When I was reading this Hegel, a lot of times I'll just be I can't focus on every word or understand everything, so I'm I generally think this is what he's talking about. But he was making a point, whenever and it comes back to the idea of negativity, suppose you're learning, suppose you're kind of spiritually guided on this pursuit of knowledge. Everything you learn, you may manifest it. Well, the next day, you're learning something new, and probably you'll find, you always look back on what you thought before, and you think that was so silly, that's so naive, or whatever. Because we're constantly in this process of becoming, negating. And so he's kind of saying, all of those things you manifest along the way, it's those are kind of illustrating this spiritual process you're going through towards a kind of total knowledge of the self. And I totally agree with this. I mean, this whole idea of following the spiritual process to know yourself, I think it's the exact same thing that Jung talks about, or I think it's the path to enlightenment. These, it's very related to these kinds of things. You do things, you learn things, and you also learn about yourself, why was I interested in that. But I think there was a bit, so I think that was all good, but I mean, I just didn't see Hegel had a certain idea of what's going to happen at the end of this process, when you obtain this total knowledge of yourself. And it didn't seem as I was reading it at first, actually, before I came to these conclusions, I was a little confused, because I was this really reminds me of just individuation, the path to enlightenment. I've never heard anyone describe the process of enlightenment in such a dull way. Such a lifeless way. It's this could, I mean, there's a lot of suffering along the way, but I mean, just the way he was describing it, it's like, and I think it makes sense now because he's like, he is describing that very real process, but his motivation is kind of power. It's like, you do this because you must do it, and you will obtain
absolute knowledge.
Absolute knowledge, There's not like, it's not like for joy. It's not for the good life.
But yeah, you can show his face to the camera again. Like, look at his face. So, I've honestly, even for myself, I had thoughts like, it's not appropriate to be happy. It's not appropriate to be an optimist, because if you're an optimist, then you're clearly ignoring important information, or you're like deluding yourself. And honestly, I've had a problem like relating to people who can just be happy, or enjoy the little things in life and things like that. Like, it's hard to actually be a happy person, at least to me. And sometimes I have those thoughts like, yeah, I am supposed to suffer. Like, maybe I am just supposed to fulfill a purpose or do a mission, and maybe my happiness doesn't matter. Maybe I'm not supposed to be happy. Like, those are thoughts I've had. But unless you wanted to respond to that, there was something else.
I do have a response to that.
Okay, share your response.
Well, I think it's a fine balance, because I do think suffering is absolutely a reality. But I think there's a balance, because some and you don't want to avoid, like you were saying, you don't want to avoid issues either. But there is a balance, because it's like, if you're in situations that make you miserable, and like, you do have the power a lot of times to change. And I'm reminded when I think of this of like David Foster Wallace, the writer. I don't know if you know about him, but I had some friends who were into David Foster Wallace, and so I spent some time kind of like trying to psychoanalyze him, maybe in a similar way to I'm psychoanalyzing Hegel, though it's very different situation. But like, one of the things that kind of puzzled me there was like, well, his writing skill is excellent. I mean, he's very tedious too, so I think there's a similar, in a way, a similar thing going on.
Okay.
But his writing skill's good, and I hear like, his speeches actually seem more clear than in his writing too. But like, he gave a famous commencement speech like about like, this is the water, and I don't need to go into it, but like, I'm like, oh, this guy really like understands a lot, But yet, he's always depressed, always miserable, and ultimately committed suicide.
Wow.
And what I found a pattern with him, which is like, he would talk about things that, and I'm sorry if I'm going on too much of a tangent,
but
go ahead. It's too late now.
All right.
We're all in. Anyways, there was a pattern where he'll talk about these things that bother him, and he'll go into vivid comedic detail. He'd talk about like how he's like in the grocery store with all these like lifeless zombies, and it's making him miserable, and all these, people driving trucks that are so aggressive, and these things that make him very unhappy. And then, but at the same time, when he's talking about like a cute little story which he likes, like a positive moral message, when he's sharing that, he always had to like preface it with like, I know this will just sound like a trite cliche nowadays, but so he's like projecting these thoughts onto other people that they're gonna think it's a cliche. He feels totally free to talk about these things that make him miserable, but he doesn't feel free to be like, oh, I find this thing really lovely. And ultimately, he was trapped. He couldn't like share his emotions, and he was trapped in this. And also, he wasn't willing. Like, if you're at the grocery store and it's making you miserable, well, stop going there. He was a successful writer. You can go somewhere else.
Go to Whole Foods.
So yeah, I think it's a fine balance too, where you kind of like you're trapping yourself somehow in a weird way. So
the sad part is I can relate to that at least a little bit, You know, if I have like a positive thought, like, okay, I need a disclaimer. Or like people like ask me to make promises of when I can achieve a certain thing, and I try to give them like the most pessimistic timeline possible. Or like I specifically would write emails in a way that's like non-committal. If I'm like I'm like pessimistic about my own ability to do things. Like, oh, I feel like I should do this thing that you're recommending to me. Oh, that would be great because you know I read Nietzsche's Genealogy of Morals, and it kind of convinced me that like I need to be like very strict about my promises. And then based on my own pessimistic bias, then that leads to me making promises in a pessimistic way. Now I'm talking about myself, but you know, that was I want to build off what you said. Now I think Hegel, even in the preface, he dedicates some time to criticizing like shallow philosophy and like the type of philosophy, like he uses certain he references certain mottos: the good, the beautiful, the true. And he says, okay, we can deconstruct these because these things are not well defined, or there's something wrong with these. And Hegel identifies consciousness as a negative process. He identifies the self, the ego, as pure negativity, and he identifies the dialectic as a negative process. And he emphasizes the importance of the negative in the truth. And he says, like, we need negativity to know the truth and to understand the truth. And negativity includes the idea of canceling out the false. But even though he's using the word negativity in this philosophical, like technical way, I have to admit, like it does actually kind of correlate with potentially his actual emotional state. Like he might actually be emotionally negative as a person.
Oh yeah, totally. I totally believe that. And I was thinking about this too, which is like where I'm debating whether I should use another Lord of the Rings reference or not.
Is it a different one?
It's a different one.
All right.
You know, they say there was another line, like, do you know where orcs came from? It's like, they were elves once, but through like torture and hatred, they were turned into orcs. I don't remember the exact line. But basically, like, where does the motivation to seek power come from? And I know people, the reason I can kind of psychoanalyze, or I think I can psychoanalyze Hegel, is because I know people who have these kind of motivations. I mean, especially out here in Silicon Valley, this is common. And there's a pattern, which is, people who had certain types of troubled childhoods. It's like, this is how I'm going to get back at the world. I was oppressed and made miserable. How am I going to, how is this going to be worth it to me?
Right.
Yes, but I think the important thing, there's a reason for it, but I don't think, even for these people, I don't think it's a good, probably they're forced to stay in a kind of negativity, because they're still, like, even though they're gaining their power over this thing, in a way, they are still enslaved by it,
Yeah, I mean, I have to confess that, like, when I was in, like, high school or college, and like for much of my life, I wasn't really getting what I wanted in a lot of different ways. And I think I have my own like set of strengths, and I can now I can like relate to Hegel in a different way. And I think Hegel might have been in a similar situation where you feel like you have to use like intellectualism to compensate for other deficiencies. And I guess that's the life strategy he pursued. And he reproduced, he had some children, and raised his kids, and got married, all that stuff. But he became the great philosopher of Germany for a while, and we still remember him today. But I guess we have to acknowledge the breadth of his legacy, and some people would blame the atrocities of the 20th century, at least partially, on his philosophy. And I can't say how fair that is, but that's what some people say. Did you have anything to say in response to that?
Nope, but that makes sense, yeah.
So, I needed to change the topic. So I think you had earlier said that you might not want to continue with the book. And so I wanted to reference something I said before, which is that a lot of the value is actually from the little details along the way, or the different stages along the way. And so I think even though we kind of can disagree with Hegel's view of the absolute, or his emphasis on it, I think that if we continue on into some other sections, like the next one is sense certainty, I think if we can spend some time on other sections, we can give him a chance for like the book itself rather than its preface or its introduction.
I mean, it will definitely give us yeah, I mean, I feel like I know his end game to some extent, but yeah, the details may be interesting. I mean, yeah, we can discuss. I definitely want to continue with the book club, or a book club, yeah.
Fair enough.
So we'll see.
I mean, like, for example, like Nietzsche had some big idea about like the Übermensch taking over, and like I don't really believe that, but I still read his books.
Yeah.
And I think like I don't really believe that we can achieve this absolute knowing. But when I look at the dialectic of sense certainty, or the dialectic of the bondsman and master, or whatever, that is, I still get some value out of it. So that's the case I would make, is the real philosophy is the things we learn along the way. Anyway, did you want to say anything?
No.
All right. Well, if that's the case, I think we should probably conclude this video. So we dished out a lot of negativity on the negative Hegel today. And I hope that we give Hegel a bit more time, but if not, we can divert to another book. And I hope everybody here in the audience enjoyed this video, whether it's Hegel or a different book or a different author. I hope y'all will tune in to future episodes of the book club. Let's see, any closing comments from you, Nate?
Nope, but I will see you in the future.
See you in the future. Goodbye.